Welcome to the inaugural event in the lecture series on and for public thinking. My name is Christopher Wild. I'm a professor of Germanic Studies and Theater and Performance Studies, but more importantly, I'm the faculty director of the Parrhesia Program for Public Discourse. Thank you, everyone, to everyone who has chosen to spend the next 90 minutes here in venerable Breasted Hall of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute rather than basking in the late winter sun on the quad. Before I introduce one of the co-organizers of this event who will introduce our esteemed guest and speaker, Elizabeth Bruenig, let me say a few words about the event and the future series it is part of. Lectures for Public Thinking. Public thinking, isn't that an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms? Historically deep thought, the contemplative life, requires withdrawal from the hubbub of public life. When Lady Philosophy visits Boethius in deep thought, he was relegated to solitary confinement in a prison cell. It is to a stove-heated room in southwestern Germany that Descartes withdraws to discover the cogito and the foundations of his wonderful science. And when it comes to share his thinking with Europe's res publica literaria, the father of modern philosophy is reticent and cautious. It is only Kant who imagined for intellectuals an important role in the public sphere, made possible by the media technology of print and a dramatic expansion of the reading public. In fact, it was only that very public sphere, in that very public sphere, that intellectuals could think and communicate unfettered from constraints and duties. Freedom of thought and discourse as the condition of possibility of enlightenment was not possible in private, only in public, so Kant believed. That vision was already wishful thinking in the 18th century. Today, the pressures on public thinking, on responsible and rigorous thinking in public, have become significantly more intense and extensive. Whereas good thinking depends on precision, nuance, and tolerance of ambiguity, today's partisan and identity politics favor stark contrasts, stereotyping, and prejudicing. Whereas constructive thinking thrives on debate and testing, today's public discourse is often about scoring points, preaching the converted, or retaining viewers. Whereas interesting and original thinking starts with a moment of wonder or astonishment, as Socrates tells us, the algorithms governing social media bombard us with the never-ending repetition of the same in order to monetize our confirmation bias. Whereas substantive thinking requires space, both in terms of word count and place apart, the all-engulfing and bite-sized deluge of information discourages the discussion of complex ideas. Where sophisticated thinking demands concentration, the monetization of attention in the digital economy fragmentizes our perceptual field and mental sphere into ever smaller particles. As knowledge producers and educators, institutions like the University of Chicago have an obligation to contribute to cultivating practices of rigorous, responsible, and nuanced thinking, not only in private, but also in public. To be sure, universities have in many ways not been heeding that obligation. Like much of society, they bow to the pressures of efficient professionalization. Rather than trying to transform the culture of public discourse, they try to stay out of the fray and not get drawn into controversy. The inauguration of this lecture series of public thinking attempts to heed this call and provide students, faculty, and staff opportunities to hear from and engage with prominent intellectuals who have made a name for themselves by their thoughtful interventions into the public sphere. Furthermore, the partnership between the college's Parrhesia Program for Public Discourse, the Neubauer Collegium for Society and Culture, and the Point magazine, founded not coincidentally by alumni of the University of Chicago's Committee of Social Thought, is exemplary for bridging the divide between scholarly and public discourse, academia and society, gown and town. By modeling public thinking, we aim to nurture our culture of public discourse across campus and beyond. Without further ado, let me introduce John Baskin to you. He received his PhD from the Committee of Social Thought with a dissertation on David Foster Wallace, which has been published with Stanford University Press. He's one of the founding editors of The Point magazine, a print and digital magazine, I quote, of philosophical writing that embodies two distinct but complementary convictions. On the one hand, that humanistic thinking has relevance for contemporary life. On the other, that our lives are full of experiences worth thinking about. As a side job, he's the Associate Director for the MA Program in Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism at the New School for Social Research. Last but not least, he's the author of numerous articles in The Point magazine, The Nation, the New York Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the New York Times. And before I pass on the gavel, let me say two things. Let me thank Rachel Wiseman from The Point magazine and Jessica Swoboda from The Point magazine and the staff of the Neubauer Collegium for all the work they have put in to bringing Elizabeth Bruenig to campus and making this first inaugural lecture possible. And then I also want to plug, we have Elizabeth Bruenig has been very generous with her time, and we have a trifecta. Namely, tomorrow she is also going to help lead our Critics Club. I think that is full, the limited number of spaces, but I just also want to bring it to your attention. There will be many more Critics Clubs that are on campus in the future. And then she will debate Agnes Callard at Night Owls tomorrow evening, 9 o'clock. So you'll have more chances to hear Elizabeth Bruenig. John?
Thank you, Chris. I'm John Baskin, one of the founding editors of The Point, and I couldn't be more excited to be here today to introduce the first speaker in our Public Thinking series. I just wanted to thank Chris and University of Chicago, the Parrhesia Program, the Neubauer, for all sort of agreeing to embark on this experiment with The Point to start a brand new program devoted to creating a more humane, thoughtful, and pluralistic public discourse. And one plug, if you want to sign up to be on our sort of Public Discourse newsletter, there's a sign-up sheet right outside the door. So now it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Elizabeth Bruenig. I first became aware of Liz Bruenig's writing when she wrote an essay for the Point Symposium, What is Church For?, back in 2017. Liz's essay was about what we could learn from Augustine and other early Christian thinkers about the possibility of what she called radical charity, something she contrasted with the more technocratic form of professionalized philanthropy in our own day. The essay exhibited what I would come to expect of Liz's writing, a blend of intellectual breadth, vivid prose, and an unusually acute awareness of the spiritual and moral dimensions of both our personal and political lives. Liz graduated from Cambridge in an MPhil in Christian theology in 2014, and then, after briefly considering an academic career, went into the magazine world. So she demonstrates some of sort of what we're trying to exemplify with the program for public thinking, of thinking about the way that academia and public publishing can be bridged. She was first as a writer at the New Republic, then as an opinion columnist at the Washington Post, before moving on to the New York Times in 2020, and now as a staff writer for The Atlantic since 2021. In 2019, Liz was named a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize for a story she wrote for the Washington Post called What Do We Owe Her Now?, an investigation of an unprosecuted gang rape that took place in her hometown of Arlington, Texas. As a columnist for The Times, Liz covered the 2020 election and the pandemic, as well as doing several stories about prisoners on death row. Throughout it all, Liz exemplified qualities we hope to instill in the students and journalists that attend our public thinking programming: a willingness to follow her interests wherever they lead, a humane attention to the arguments and lives of others, and an ability to trace the way that big ideas, whether religious, philosophical, or political, play out in our everyday lives. One of her last pieces at the Times was a beautiful essay, at least in my opinion, for Mother's Day, about her experience within her highly educated demographic of being a younger mother. That essay, among many other things she has written, caused some controversy, to put it mildly, on Twitter. Which brings me to another reason that Liz was our ideal choice to speak today. As a younger writer making her way through the publishing world in the late 2010s, she had a front row seat to both the pleasures and the perils of social media and its impact on our intellectual discussions. She's also been someone who's been able to write about and comment on that discussion with a depth and insight that goes far beyond our usual buzzwords, freedom of speech, cancel culture, etc., something we're also committed to doing in the program for public thinking. In her talk today, Liz revisits the theme of forgiveness, something she has written about previously in the context of the lives of men and women on death row, but also in relation to our increasingly punitive and often unforgiving public intellectual conversation. Thanks, Liz, for coming to speak with us today, and welcome.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. Please forgive me. I'm a little stuffy. If I have to, I apologize. So I'm just going to get right into it, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. How can one be a truly forgiving person without effectively condoning everything everyone has ever done? I first began grappling seriously with this question when Pope Benedict XVI passed away, and I was asked to write a short retrospective on his life. My initial impulse was to take a rather unsparing account. I had my reasons. Benedict XVI had made serious errors in his handling of the Catholic sex abuse crisis, and I feel especially obligated as a Catholic to be scrupulously honest about such matters. But I had my doubts as well. Benedict was a favorite of a certain kind of right-inclined, aesthetically traditionalist, internet-based fellow I've occasionally beefed with. So I suspected my own motives for tending towards a tone so harsh and exacting. I decided to wait and write until I could straighten myself out. There are certain writers I read in order to clear my head, and there's another category for when I need to muddle my thoughts. It must be that the turns their minds make reacquaint my mind with the way it ought to move, because reading them typically sets me thinking clearly again. In this case, I went through a few of Hannah Arendt's essays and a quarter or so of Eichmann in Jerusalem and went to bed. But first I prayed, and while I was praying, I became aware of a thought. How can you write with such simple human sympathy for confessed killers on death row, but not for this dead man who authored grave deeds which still never rose to the level of murder, and many good deeds, too? I wasn't being fair. Yet I doubted this thought, too, and told myself that it was the difference in their influence or social power or obligations that made the Pope's sins worse than the convicts. Then again, I thought, the killer asserts the most absolute and permanent form of power one can assert over another person. Death is the threat that all other threats imply. It is the worst crime. And it didn't really matter for my purposes if one wanted to argue that the Pope's wrongdoings morally amounted to murder. All that meant was that the two men ought to be equal in my sight, the killer and the one just as bad. I hadn't actually escaped the charge of unfairness. I wondered, to whom am I being unfair? It occurred to me you can be unfair to someone either by being too forgiving or too unforgiving. There has to be some kind of balance between justice and mercy, with mercy being the work of forgiveness and punishment being the work of justice. All the while I continued thinking, I think you're not exactly supposed to do that while you're praying, possibly. But I did that anyway, and I'm always ruminating. Lots of people say that I shouldn't extend sympathy of any kind, not even the barest sort of human understanding, to the men on death row that I write about. Some of their reasons I find totally unconvincing and repellent, basically arguments from sadism. But the charges I take more seriously have to do with dignity and justice. That by sharing any fellow feeling with a killer, I've implicitly denied the value of their victim's life, an insult to justice, or have judged the inmate irresponsible for their actions, which is an insult to their human dignity. To respect justice and honor the prisoner's dignity by holding them accountable for their actions, I've made an intentional and concerted effort to tell their stories in the fairest way I can, without obscuring any aspect of their crimes or their humanity. Both seem relevant to the question at hand, which is, ought this person live? That I mean to answer it in a particular way, yes, neither requires nor tempts me to be unfair in the telling. If I was being fair to the prisoners, this was bad news for the Pope, but there was a silver lining. If I had figured out the right way to write about the prisoners, then I already knew the right way to write about the Pope. All I had to do was keep track of proportion, to try to distinguish the best of the man from the worst and to reveal a human being as best as I could. That and a stiff edit would keep things fair. But I didn't want to kid myself. I knew this would require a good deal of reading and research on my part, and I would actually have to develop a genuine sense of sympathy with a man about whom I now sheepishly admitted to myself on the verge of sleep I knew relatively little. Some writers can spin glowing profiles and elegiac obituaries out of contempt, resentment, or more shockingly, total indifference. I can't do that. The less elemental something feels, the more I struggle to write it. I'm fortunate not to be all that alienated from my work, or not much, which is a modern marvel. But anyway, I was falling asleep, and a thought came to me from the abyss. You should talk about this at the University of Chicago. I bring up this tussle with forgiveness, fairness, justice, and mercy because it's a minor example of a tangle of broad issues I struggle with all the time. Writing about death row and executions, as well as crime and punishment, forgiveness and mercy, or social prescriptions on those things in particular cases, are always at the forefront of my mind, such that I'm always noticing the strange relationship between contemporary society and these seemingly uncomplicated virtues. In reality, these are deeply complex principles with all sorts of quagmires and questions, as I've tried to show above, and they are worthy of serious consideration. And so in recognition of the broad philosophical conversation around forgiveness, and largely for my own sake, what I'd like to do today is try to give a rough account of what forgiveness is, to detail some of the long-standing and more recent critiques of the practice, and to offer some thoughts in support of forgiveness with those critiques in mind. So to get started, what is forgiveness? Definitions of forgiveness vary across place and time. I suspect it's safe to assume that since there have been offenses between people, which dates to the dawn of human history, there have been practices of foregoing vengeance and discharging feelings of anger and bitterness. And for just as long as these related practices, mercy and forgiveness, which are often used interchangeably but deserve their own respective definitions, have existed, I would further guess there has been some dispute as to whether they constitute vices or virtues. We might look to the ancients to help us trace the roots of forgiveness and mercy in our culture, and to help us distinguish the two concepts from one another. In his book Before Forgiveness, the NYU classicist David Constant argues from a careful reading of relevant Greek and Latin terms, which I'm not going to quote to you. Not today, Satan. I don't know how to pronounce any of that. Compared to their contemporary counterparts, that the Greeks and Romans lived in a world without forgiveness as we know it. The modern English usage of forgiveness, he writes, quote, implies a confession of guilt on the part of the offender along with clear signs of remorse and repentance, which signifies, quote, a complex of sentiments between forgiver and forgiven that is in some sense transformative. Yet in Greek and Roman thought, concepts commonly translated as forgive, quote, were rather perceived as resting on the restoration of the dignity of the injured party, whether through compensation, gestures of deference, or else by way of discounting the offense on the grounds that it was in some sense involuntary or unintentional. Much of the work of appeasing anger and voiding vengeance in those societies was done by righting the relations of status and power that were initially upended in the offenses. Rather than confessing to having intentionally done something wrong, expressing remorse, and requesting amnesty from vengeance, a person who had caused offense to another in the ancient world might insist that the harm was entirely unanticipated or unintentional. In other words, that there was never any plan in place to offend the other's dignity. Constant points to an example in a 3rd century Herodotus play, wherein an enraged mistress accuses her slave of having slept with someone else. The slave confesses, humbling himself, but this isn't enough to assuage his mistress' wounded pride. She still intends to have him whipped, except that she is reminded of a religious festival approaching for which the remittance of punishments is called for. The mistress's dignity is assuaged by an obligation to a higher order of power. The slave's confession doesn't signify a greater transformation, and is rather an effort at making punishing him beneath her dignity, at any rate. Meanwhile, Seneca's De Clementia, either on clemency or on mercy, offers mercy as the distinguishing characteristic that separates a just, reasonable, and righteous king from a wicked tyrant. And part of the tyrant's failure to show mercy is an incapacity of reason and self-restraint, an almost bestial inability to recognize himself already as the master, and need not avenge his mastery to wild excess to affirm it. One whose dignity is so high as to nearly escape offense altogether need not so jealously defend it. Now, what's curious about these concepts, at least to me, is that while I take Constan's argument that the ancients didn't share our modern concept of forgiveness quite seriously, it also appears that they had a very robust theory of mercy and an even fairly robust practice of it. In their book, The Decline of Mercy in Public Life, political science professors Alex Tuckness and John M. Parrish trace the downfall of civic expressions of mercy from the ancient to the modern world and find that the Enlightenment, with all of its worthy emphasis on impartial justice and fairness and equality before the law, created a heightened tension between mercy and justice that ultimately broke in favor of a harsher and more uniform justice, as opposed to a world with greater room for mercy in the exercise of law. And so it seems historically we can track the rise of forgiveness alongside the fall of mercy. Forgiveness, as Constant implies, seems to be something moral, something interpersonal, dynamic, with an emotional basis. It is a practice, but is emotional practice. In one of the more common academic formulations of forgiveness, Charles Griswold's, which is used by Martha Nussbaum, it's used by David Constant, forgiveness is described as an explicitly social, two-person process that must satisfy a number of conditions. For instance, the wrongdoer must admit their responsibility for their wrongdoing. They must renounce their actions. They must express regret for the consequences. They must commit to becoming the kind of person who does not cause such injuries, must show they understand the nature and impact of their wrongdoing, and must give an account of how they came to do wrong and intend to do better. It is, as Constant alluded, a transformative process, something Griswold is very forthright about. While the offender goes through a process of developing and expressing regret for prior transgressions, which implies a certain reorientation towards oneself and one's past, the injured party also experiences an almost total shift in sentiments and plans regarding the offender, which implies a reorientation towards one's past feelings and future intentions. For Griswold, forgiveness includes the forswearing of resentment and revenge. I agree these are necessary components of forgiveness, but it's helpful here to say a word about mercy. Political philosopher Gene Hampton defined mercy thus, quote, "Whereas forgiveness is a change of heart towards a wrongdoer that arises out of our decision to see him as morally decent rather than bad, mercy is the suspension or mitigation of a punishment that would otherwise be deserved as retribution, and which is granted out of pity and compassion for the wrongdoer." Seneca might quibble with the causes of mercy in Hampton's telling, but otherwise the principle is pretty much unchanged. Mercy is when you have the right to exact some sort of penalty or punishment upon someone for having wronged you, and you elect to do less than you could or nothing at all. It's easy to see how mercy, in this sense, constitutes an element of forgiveness, though Hampton herself points out that the two can exist independently of one another. The example she gives specifically is that in Puritan New England, if a criminal was about to be hanged but then repented of his crime, the community would throw him a feast, they would reconcile themselves to him, and then hang him. So you can have forgiveness and no mercy. In other words, they can be decoupled. For my own part, I am a journalist. I am not a philosopher. So what I have in mind when I use the term forgiveness is probably less exact than much of the above. I'm not entirely sure whether forgiveness ought to be conditional or unconditional, and I suspect that it probably varies case to case. but I do feel it has to do with forsaking an emotionally salient set of rights or privileges one acquires when injured. I'll say more about this particular angle on forgiveness later, but I should point out that in my work as a journalist, I've come across real-life reasons for thinking this way about forgiveness. A most remarkable example occurred just recently when I was talking to a woman who has forgiven her grandmother's murderer, who is currently on death row. She was explaining to me what that forgiveness felt like. I asked her if she ever wavered and went back and forth after her initial forgiveness of this man who murdered her grandmother. And she said, I waver only if I try to go back to that night. I can't go back to that night. I simply can't go back to the night it happened. So in some sense, she had in her possession a memory or a thought or a source of anger, a well of anger that she could go back to at one point. But after her forgiveness, she herself has relinquished, has forsaken, has given up, which I think is a very useful way to think about forgiveness. It's the relinquishing of a certain set of privileges, rights, emotions that a person has when they're wronged. Controversial elements in forgiveness remain. For example, while Griswold requires several conditions to be met before forgiveness properly can be dispensed, certain Christian Peace Church traditions famously require far less and even offer unconditional forgiveness regularly. While some thinkers find unconditional forgiveness practically insulting to the dignity of the injured party, others view forgiveness more in the domain of gift and feel that placing numerous conditions on the distribution of forgiveness reduces a virtuous expression of self-giving to an item of exchange. It isn't exactly clear to me which version of forgiveness is the better one, but it is clear that we're already verging on a discussion of forgiveness many complaints. So let's turn to that. Here we are on critiques of forgiveness. Sometimes we forgive, and sometimes we don't, and the cases that warrant our forgiveness versus the ones that don't can be somewhat surprising. Consider a pair of more or less recent episodes of publicized forgiveness and their reception. There is the case of Megan Hall, a Tennessee police officer who came to the attention of the internet when she and several members of her small-town department were disciplined for having sexual relationships, sometimes on the clock. For her numerous trysts, Hall became a temporary laughingstock online and a stand-in for feminine infidelity at large. Eventually, tabloids learned from colleagues of Hall's husband, Jedediah Hall, that the man had chosen to forgive his wife and attempt to salvage their marriage instead of leaving her. Among the comments on that story, quote, "Husband is a real dummy." Quote, "This woman has completely disrespected him as a man. Grow some balls and leave her. You deserve way better." Quote, "Worst thing he can do at this moment is try to work things out with her." And on and on. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, a woman named Lindsay Clancy attacked and killed her 3 children before jumping from a second-floor window in her home. Clancy survived. Her husband, Patrick Clancy, shortly released a statement in which he explicitly forgave his wife and asked the public to do so as well, writing, "I want to ask all of you that you find it deep within yourselves to forgive Lindsay as I have. The real Lindsay was generously loving and caring towards everyone, me, our kids, family, friends, and her patients. The very fibers of her soul are loving. All I wish for her now is that she can somehow find peace." Patrick's plea for forgiveness was covered on Good Morning America, which later uploaded the segment to YouTube, where it received acclaim along the following lines. Quote, "This is heartbreaking. Mental illness is real and it can happen to everyone, to us, if not addressed properly. I wish healing and prayers for the family. My condolences." Quote, "This is such a sad story. I cannot imagine what she will be going through once she recovers from postpartum psychosis." Quote, "Too sad for words. I can't imagine what she must have been feeling in order to do that. I forgive her because she's going to spend the rest of her life trying to figure out how to forgive herself." What immediately struck me about the admittedly non-scientific contrast between the tenor of the respective receptions of each act of forgiveness was that the far worse offender had evidently been met with far warmer feelings. But it isn't that homicide is easier to forgive than infidelity. It is even clear to me that the spectating public is in any position to forgive anything, which I'll return to. It's that in the second circumstance, forgiveness isn't actually in play. It's very easy to forgive when you don't actually have to forgive anyone. To return to Griswold's formulation of forgiveness, it's enough to point out that the first condition has to do with responsibility and therefore culpability, to clarify why that may be. In the Clancy case, the woman who killed her 3 children is distinguished from the real Lindsay, the same woman as she was before her mental condition dramatically deteriorated. Her illness is such that her crimes are essentially those of another person. Therefore, she ought to be forgiven for them. So for forgiveness to apply, one needs genuine culpability on behalf of the wrongdoer, to which that person can allocute, repent, and so on. Means of explaining diminished culpability, i.e. that the person in question is a child, that they were intoxicated, impassioned, under duress, are important morally, but they don't constitute forgiveness, which can only be addressed to culpable wrongdoing. Usually this kind of wrongdoing causes harm to the wrong party, which is why it's so odd that the viewing public in both of our cases felt entitled to redress whatsoever. But I'll get to that. This isn't to presume that their reasons, the reasons of the spectating public, are automatically suspicious. A careful observer might point out that people are motivated to enforce the moral norms of their societies, and that the feeling of offense caused by violations thereof is a rearguard action against further violations. It causes us to behave protectively, in other words, of the norms we cherish as a group and rely on one another to uphold. That forgiveness dispensed too readily and too liberally might extinguish this necessary social reaction and therefore give rise to generally bad behavior is one critique of forgiveness, although typically this critique is aimed at the flabby, to use philosopher Geoffrey Murphy's term, sort of unconditional forgiveness that expects little of its subjects as opposed to more exacting and conditional forms of forgiveness. Then there are the arguments that forgiveness poses a risk or indicates a problem with the forgiver's self-respect. Murphy, drawing on Nietzsche, delves into this critique at length in his and Hampton's book Forgiveness and Mercy. Quote, "A too ready tendency to forgive may properly be regarded as a vice because it may be a sign that one lacks respect for oneself. In that sense, to forgive is to, quote, convey emotionally either that we do not think we have rights or that we do not take our rights very seriously." This gloss is not hard to understand. In a particularly cynical reading, a forgiver's willingness to discharge resentment and revenge are evidence of a lack of pride, seeing as someone who held themselves in proper esteem would vindicate their rights when violated. Versions of this critique are visible in the response to the forgiving of Megan Hall, in people who seem almost angry at the husband for forgiving his wife, because it evinces a lack of self-respect or dignity. These so far are perhaps the more conservative critiques of forgiveness from strength and pride and social order. But there are also critiques of forgiveness from the left. In fact, I've just had the privilege of reading a soon-to-be released book by UC Riverside philosopher Maisha Cherry entitled Failures of Forgiveness, which very eloquently sums up most of the left liberal critiques of forgiveness that have grown in visibility over the last several decades. In particular, Cherry is skeptical of forgiveness because it burdens the wrong party with moral work. In my view, there's no getting around this fact. And also because, practically speaking, forgiveness in the United States appears to be valued on a racialized basis, with black forgiveness of white wrongdoings being highly prized and praised as noble without any kind of symmetry. Cherry points out that such an undue focus on black forgiveness redirects emotional energy away from the redress of racist offenses and instead compels people to expect forgiveness and mercy rather than to combat the underlying systemic injustices that create the initial offenses. This leads into a broader critique of the role of forgiveness in society and interpersonal relationships at large, where Cherry worries that forgiveness can become a self-serving practice encouraged by the powerful in order to maintain their status as oppressors. And so the critics of forgiveness, right and left, seem broadly to hold that the practice is, or can be, in fact, injurious itself, both to the person who was wronged and has the option to forgive, who in so doing may declare their own lack of self-respect, relinquish rightful anger, and invite further offenses against themselves and similar members of society, and to the person who has done wrong and stands to be forgiven, who in so doing would risk being held less than morally accountable for their actions and thus less than equal, and who might also deduce from their encounter with forgiveness that morally wrong actions are consequence-free and all but condoned by society. On a personal level, forgiveness is just a difficult and harrowing process. It is emotionally taxing to engage a person who has wronged you in a process of transformation towards forgiveness and reconciliation, possibly for your sake, but much for theirs. Being faced with a genuine apology, even, is a strange and disarming experience. One day you're living your life, wronged, mad about it, and completely within your rights to feel that way. And the next, the very person who put you in the position of being angry and indignant to begin with appears with some words that are difficult to hear and whose intention is to steal away your protective and socially sanctioned aura of anger. It is no wonder that we scrutinize apologies to the degree that we do. Oftentimes, it's more comfortable to simply reject them. But I'm going to argue now that it's worthwhile to take them seriously and to forgive. So, why forgiveness? I've learned a lot about life, observing people and their behavior as a journalist, but I have learned even more about these things as a mother. My children are soon to be 7 and 4, and they know that generally adults don't permit them to hurt each other. In fact, my husband, who is a lawyer and a philosophy major, has made this common rule even more explicit in the charter that mandates our older daughter's allowance, which was not my making, which provides that $1 can be docked from the weekly amount for, quote, knowingly and willingly hurting your sister. He's got her there, man. But being clever little people, the children already know that there is a major exception to this general rule: self-defense, including the vindication of one's rights. This is why when I find my kids locked in some kind of combat, they both inevitably provide me with the same exact moral story. I wasn't doing anything, and then she hit me first. Now, rare cases of simultaneous unprovoked aggression aside, they do happen. The story is usually true, at least coming from one participant in any given conflict. And the girls have learned to tell it because it is effective. We as a society do care who instigates conflict versus who merely responds in kind. This is because we basically respect an individual's right, when injured, to vindicate their rights or express their anger or reassert their agency, or however you want to look at it. And what we do in those cases as a society is not so much as give people a prescribed set of behaviors or countermeasures to be taken in any instance of being wrong. There's no specific list of socially prescribed revenge projects, but rather we take a pre-existing moral limitation on what a person can do to another and remove it. And we do this because we deem that both parties involved in the conflict deserve it. The proof is in the pudding. Though I tell my daughters I don't care who started what and that neither of them should be hitting one another, when I can reasonably ascertain who did actually instigate the conflict, I take measures to reverse their action and sometimes to punish them, while the other child is usually the recipient of some kind of reparation. Let me give you an example. Suppose my children are playing together when my younger girl discovers a dress-up gown she would like to put on. As she begins to shimmy it on, my older daughter notices it and decides that she would like to wear the dress-up gown. So she pulls it off my younger daughter and puts it on herself. In retaliation, my younger daughter pulls her big sister's hair, demanding that her gown be given back. The scuffle summons me, and after hearing both of them recount roughly the same story, I lightly chastise my younger daughter for pulling her sister's hair, but then direct my older daughter to give the dress-up gown back to her little sister and strongly chastise her for taking it in the first place. From my older daughter's point of view, her little sister is having all the fun. Not only did she get the gown in the end, she got to pull her sister's hair and got nothing more than a gift for it. But this is because my younger daughter was operating in a state of moral exception. She was behaving in a state where the normal rules of morality, such as the general prohibition on pulling her sister's hair, did not apply. I would like her not to attack her sister generally, so I chastised her for it, but I clearly didn't rule against her, and she wasn't ultimately punished. In fact, she got what she wanted in the end. You can imagine how tantalizing a loophole like this is to a child. It represents the opportunity not only to get what one desires, but the opportunity to indulge a darker, repressed desire too. And the only precondition for doing so is being wronged in the first place. As you can imagine, "she hit me first" is something of a prized status among small children for this reason. But are these states of moral exception equally attractive to adults? That is to say, knowing for a fact that we will hurt one another, and nothing seems so clear-cut or obvious to me as that fact, we will hurt one another. Is it possible that adults too are attracted to states of moral exception, in which they can not only pursue projects of vengeance that would normally be socially prescribed, but to do so with full social sanction? I certainly think so. Consider the state of social media, where people frequently go in order to find something to be angry about so they can express their anger in ways that would typically be forbidden but are permissible in cases of having been wronged. Had the social media user not sought out an example of someone doing something offensive or outrageous, they wouldn't have anger to discharge. But it seems to me that acquiring anger and the right to discharge it is precisely the point of a lot of social media use. You go to find stuff to get pissed off about so you can yell at someone about it, because yelling at people is kind of fun and it's something you don't get to do under normal conditions, only when you're really mad. So you have to go acquire reasons to be mad. Cable TV also offers you lots of reasons to go get pissed off at people and yell at them. In a forum we both participated in for the Boston Review, University of Chicago philosopher Agnes Callard. Get some hooting and hollering? No? Yeah. Once observed that if a person is wronged and therefore made angry at another person, there's no logical reason for that anger to be extinguished ever. Sure, it may run its course, and the individual may become bored with the emotion or simply elect to drop it. But there's no logical reason, once the anger is felt for the initial offense, that one should ever stop feeling angry, even once one has avenged himself many times. I believe that Callard is quite right about this, and that the observation bears itself out in daily life, where we can see people nurse grudges for decades at a time. But it also means people can enter states of moral exception and remain there indefinitely if they so choose, and there's no logical reason to put an end to them. Once a person has been wronged, they have been wronged in perpetuity. Therefore, once a person has entered a state of moral exception, they can remain there in perpetuity. But this creates a problem for society. A few minutes ago, I said that when a person is the object of revenge, we as a society deem that they deserve to be subjected to behavior outside the moral norm. And why is this the case? Because we feel that through the commission of bad acts, people surrender certain rights they have that protect them generally from those behaviors. This is what I mean when I say we imagine that in cases of revenge, both parties deserve it. The avenger deserves their state of moral exception on account of having been wronged, and the wrongdoer deserves their own unique state of moral exception on account of having done wrong. This means that people who do wrong make themselves lesser than the rest of us. Through the commission of wrongdoing, they sustain a kind of moral injury that diminishes their rights. If you, like me, are the kind of person who believes that society functions best when we all have equal dignity and equal moral status, then it's clear that the state of moral exception created when people wrong one another is antithetical to a good society. The best option would be for no one to ever wrong anyone else. This is a great idea. Everybody should try it. But the more realistic option when faced with the fact that people will wrong each other is that states of moral exception are potentially desirable and potentially permanent is to generally counsel forgiveness. From this standpoint, forgiveness isn't so much a sign of one's respect for oneself. It's really not much of a commentary on how one views oneself at all. It isn't expressive in that way, which makes it kind of a weird fit for contemporary society. It's rather a sign of respect for a certain kind of society. It's a response to being wronged that intentionally negates a potential state of moral exception and returns the wrongdoer to their initial status as a moral equal. To me, this is a prerequisite for, rather than a barrier to, a truly equal society, the kind that critics like Cherry have in mind. And it's easy to put real-life stories to this theory of forgiveness. I'm currently working on a death penalty case in Texas in which a prisoner brutally murdered a man's sister using an entire butcher's block of knives during the course of a robbery in 1993. Though the man spent years angry with the killer and supported her conviction and death sentence at the time, he has since relinquished his anger due to changes in his own life and has come to feel differently about her death sentence. Since forgiving her, he has taken steps to make sure that her execution will not be carried out, definitively reversing the most extreme expression of inequality humankind can muster. While he once saw her life as so unequal to his and others as to be fit for taking, he now views her life as to be so valuable as to be worth saving. This is the work of forgiveness. To me, this is a vision of the role and purpose of forgiveness that leaves open a broad range of ways for forgiveness to take shape: conditional and unconditional, instantaneous and delayed, with and without reservation. It does require, in my view, the inclusion of mercy, as sparing an individual from behavior strictly justified by their offense is key to restoring their rights and dignity. But this does not require that an individual who has done wrong be spared consequences and entirely, as some consequences are justified by factors other than the offense itself. For example, acts of reparation and repair may be justified by the necessities of the injury rather than permitted by the diminishment of the wrongdoer's rights. But perhaps the most important thing about this broad reading of forgiveness is that it recommends not so much a specific kind of practice as a specific kind of person, a forgiving kind. This is what I eventually decided on when trying to write my mind about how to handle telling stories about convicted killers and retired popes. It isn't so much that every case of wrongdoing ought to be forgiven on the same terms or in the same way, as much as every case ought to be viewed with a forgiving eye, approached with an openness to that transformation in sentiments that Griswold writes about. We should find ourselves ever open to changing our minds about people and their actions, both in direct interpersonal interactions where we have standing to forgive, but also in the spectator relationships we tend to engage in contemporarily, wherein we form moral judgments about one another without direct interactions. In those cases, we may not exactly have standing to forgive, as we ourselves may not have been wronged, though we may well be angry. Nevertheless, that anger is enough to make approaching the subject with a forgiving disposition worthwhile, since it suggests an incipient inequality of moral statuses. Forgiveness is hard. It's not, as Cherry points out, a magic process that redresses all wrongs, nor is it necessarily a short and straightforward process. But in my view, it's a process that unites the wronged and wrongdoer in a plan of peace. And since we've all been on both sides of that equation hoping for the same thing, it seems a most useful virtue. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're going to do a short Q&A for probably 20 minutes. So if you have questions, raise your hand. Jess and I will come and bring a mic so that you can ask your question.
So the way that you describe forgiveness, like with the man who forgave the woman who killed his sister it would be, it's a real transformation and almost like a surprise, like a new way of looking at the world. Can you have a mindset where you're preparing to be surprised?
That's a real heater. I mean, I think it's possible to be open to have an openness to a transformation, right? To have a sense of the changeability of circumstances and people, right? To feel not so tightly locked into your judgments about people. I think that's what being a forgiving person is to provide some openness, some room in your judgments about people. I think that's sort of how that would manifest. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think my question is a little bit opposite of public thinking, maybe closer to private dreaming of some sort. But how do these things you describe relate to self-forgiveness? Or is that a prerequisite, and how does that relate?
That's a very good question. I think about that question a lot. For Griswold, a lot of these, sort of metaphorical ways that we talk about forgiveness are sort of aside from the question of what forgiveness is philosophically. So, for example, he's very dismissive of political forgiveness and forms of forgiveness where the work is done by representation. In terms of forgiving yourself, I think that the closest way that I can describe it, by analogy to the forgiveness that we're talking about here, is just to be open to a transformed way of viewing yourself. Right, as you have a way of viewing yourself that has to do with an offense that you have committed either against others or against yourself, and you have to be open to viewing yourself as someone who is something more or something different than the self that is intimately attached to those behaviors. And I think it may not be a prerequisite for forgiveness of others, but I think it's intimately tied up in the kind of practice you need to do in order to forgive others. So it wouldn't surprise me if it helped to forgive yourself in order to forgive others. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just have a practical question first. Is what you read today or thought about today or presented going to be published anywhere? Because I'd love to revisit it.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure my husband would put it on his blog or something for you. Yeah.
So I will now go look for your husband's blog.
Oh, okay.
Perfect.
There we go. Yeah.
My second question is, I'm really interested in the two anecdotes you set up of the woman who cheated on her husband and the woman who killed her children, and how in the second case, it's not true forgiveness because we don't find her culpable.
Yes.
In the first place, because it's not the real person. And I wonder if it's also true that through the act of transformation, you suddenly become a different person, and so you are no longer culpable as the person that you used to be. And so part of it is convincing the other person that you are now a new person, so you're no longer culpable for your past actions.
Yeah, so there's an interesting paradox here, and I think Agnes has written on it, which is that when you're apologizing, you're doing kind of two contradictory things at once. You're saying, I own my action, I am culpable for it, and I am sorry, but at the same time, you're disowning it and saying, but now I am not someone who would do such a thing, and I completely disown my action, and I regret it altogether. But they're simultaneous in apology. And so I think that's the sort of the weird alchemy of apology and repentance, is that you have to do that double movement sort of at the same time. And I think that's why Griswold is so careful to talk about it as a process, because there is a first movement, which is owning and being culpable for and sort of existing in your accountability for your action. And I think that's the real prerequisite to a genuine apology, is owning that action, saying it was mine, giving an account of how it came about. And then what Griswold is really looking for in his sort of allocution condition is a story about how you came about no longer being that kind of person. And so you'll see that in apologies, right, where someone says, look, I'm sorry, I was not thinking right, I was really mad, and I said something I shouldn't have said, I'm so sorry, I'm feeling a lot better now, I'm back in my right mind, and now that I have my head on straight, I shouldn't have said that, right? So you have sort of a story of how someone was one way and now is another, and in that way they can kind of claim that and claim that culpability, but at the same time disown it going forward. So it is an interesting paradox there.
So sorry, I just have a follow-up, which is, I think I also heard, if I understand correctly, that we should forgive people not for the sake of the transformation and the new person they've become, and forgiving the fact that mistakes happen with just being human, but rather as a societal norm, that we don't want people to have this sort of justified stance of violence or moral domain that's not connected to something we care about. So I guess I just wonder if that's treating the person too much as a means and not enough as an end. Like the person, like in the case where we treat them as an end, we're recognizing their humanness and dignity. And in the other case, we're treating them as a means to the larger society. I wonder what you think about that.
I think you have to do a little of both, at the same time. And on one level, you're looking at the whole societal picture of it's not good for me and kind of a virtue sort of standpoint to be someone who operates in a state of moral exception. I don't want that for myself, so I'm going to be forgiving. On the other hand, I think at the same time, you can say, look, if it were me, I would want to be forgiven. And you can apply all of these sort of humanizing thoughts that help you see that transformation in the person that you're forgiving. I think all of those are very helpful, and I think they're good arguments for forgiveness. I just think this one happens to be inclusive of all those other plans. I have a plan-inclusive counterplan.
Yeah, I see. That's very neat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over here. I had a question about it feels like an opposition between vengeance and forgiveness, or at least continued vengeance and forgiveness. And this reminds me of the humanities, where there's an opposition between vengeance and justice. So what do you think about the relationship between justice and forgiveness?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, there's a correlation with justice and forgiveness. So forgiveness has a role in, obviously because it comes wrapped up with mercy, it can influence the penalty aspect of justice. Justice is, I think it was Agnes who said to me once, it's the good kind of harm, right? Vengeance, penalties, punishments, that can be the work of justice, and forgiveness can have a role in kind of limiting or truncating some of the penalties and punishments associated with justice. But socially, we have all kinds of other reasons for our civil justice system that are not strictly related to, establishing an equal moral dignity, but don't necessarily interfere with that project either. And so, I mean, I think the relationship between forgiveness and justice is complicated. I think people see mercy and justice oftentimes as being in tension, and I can understand that. But I think there is more of a place for mercy and justice, especially in our justice system, than is currently made room for. And I see it in cases like the Texas case, right, where an individual who felt forgiveness extended mercy to his sister's killer and essentially succeeded in getting her execution called off. That's the kind of relationship I would like to see between mercy and justice. If there was more room for it, I would be pleased.
What is the role of historical memory in creating the conditions for the possibility of forgiveness? I mean, to what extent does the moral effort to depict with precision and thoroughness what happened, to what extent does that open up some possibilities of whether it's a killer in Texas, whether it's Northern Ireland, whether it's Rwanda? Yeah, I mean, that's in contrast to, say, pop Foucaultian genealogy.
Yeah, I mean, I think group forgiveness and group reconciliation, especially on the sort of political level, like in Northern Ireland or South Africa or places that have had major pushes to try to reunite and reconcile populations that have been in severe conflict. Forgiveness functions differently than it does interpersonally. But I think that condition that Griswold points to of a sort of allocution, of a sort of establishment of a coherent narrative, and I think one of the important things about it, though Griswold doesn't touch on this as deeply as I would, is that establishes a story that both sides agree on, and it creates a commonality of history between them that allows them to sort of reunite and form this plan of peace. And so to that degree, I think that, historical memory is extremely important in reconciliation, because unless you can have that united and agreed upon theory of history there, I think it's going to be very difficult to make a plan of peace going forward.
Oh, hi there. So I just want to revisit your story regarding your daughters. So I'm a parent myself of a 20-month-old, and I'm curious, how are you teaching forgiveness and mercy, especially because you mentioned that you chastise, and they are of the age of reason to know that they did wrong, wrong against their sister. So I'm curious about that, and then also maybe tie it in. I know that you have a love of the parable of the prodigal son and the father granting forgiveness, which is radical, like mercy in itself. So I just want to see how that all just ties in with your past works and your past writings and where you are today as a parent.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to them about forgiveness all the time, and because it doesn't come naturally. It's something that has to be learned, and it's a practice. So it's something that, is effortful. It's something that makes a lot more sense to my older daughter than my younger daughter, and it's something that she has taken on kind of as a responsibility to her younger sister. And so at this stage in her development, that's sort of how I'm pitching it to her is, look, your little sister is very young. She's only 3 years old. She's going to be 4 in July. But she's still learning how to interact with people. And so sometimes, not always, but sometimes the things she does to you, they're, in some ways outside of her control. Now, this is forgiveness with training wheels, right? Because it allows her to explain it away as, well, she's not really culpable. She doesn't really know what she's doing, but it gets her in the habit of looking with a forgiving eye on the things her sister does. And then I think the other thing that I try to do is just to be forgiving, right? So when I have conflicts in my life, I typically try to clear them up with forgiveness, right? So if her dad and I have an argument or something, that's, we're always perpetually going to forgive each other. But it's something that I'll talk to her about. She'll say, "Weren't you and Dad arguing about X, Y, Z?" And I'll be like, "Yeah, but we cleared it up. It's fine. We forgive each other because we love each other." And so instead of being angry when we disagree, we come back together again. And you should do that with your sister, and you should do that with your friends. Friendship among 7-year-olds is it's intense. It's like kind of violent at times. And so we have a lot of conversations about being kind friends, being forgiving is part of that. And I mean, I hope I'm keeping pace with her development. I hope I'm doing a good job. They take it easy on each other often enough that I am, feel warm-hearted here or there seeing it. So that's a very good question. Thank you.
Sorry, I just had a quick question. If you encountered in your work instances where someone is willing to forgive and the party that's injured is unwilling to accept that, or what you make of that?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. So one problem I'm very fascinated with is why it's so repellent to us when someone tries to forgive us for something we don't think we've done wrong. So if you don't think you've done anything wrong and someone comes to you and is like, "Get this, I forgive you," why do you want to throw up? Because they're saying something that's fundamentally nice to you. But I think that, the reason is because they're implying that they looked at you as being in a diminished status and now they're trying to raise you up. And you're like, "No, I'm already an equal with you. Don't treat me as though I'm not." And so, I mean, I think that's a very interesting moral problem. I've run into sort of every kind of arrangement of forgiveness you can imagine. I've had people who wanted to forgive a guy on death row, but they were never really able to connect. I've had someone who was forgiven, but just kind of couldn't believe it. Maybe couldn't really forgive himself. And I know death row volunteers who just can't forgive themselves, can't accept forgiveness, and want to be executed for that reason. So, I mean, you see it go every which way, but I am very fascinated by that moral problem, yeah.
Hi. I'm asking myself whether I missed something in the case of, say, the internet. deciding whether or not to forgive someone who, say, merely offended their moral sense, and yet they weren't directly the injured party. Why does it belong to these other people to forgive, or does it really? And then similarly, I'm asking myself about the case of the man who forgave the woman on death row for killing his sister, and in turn, these cases where the public is deciding whether or not to forgive people. Something that I don't think you touched on is that sometimes people will forgive because they want to allow themselves some leniency, whether or not they were the offended party or not. They're thinking, like, I've fallen into this situation before, so I might as well sympathize with them. And an ancient view is you can't have any judges have any exposure to any evil, because then they'll be too lenient, too easygoing when they shouldn't be. So, two related questions.
Yeah, so I think the question of standing is an interesting one. Because I think we all kind of intuitively feel that you have to have some kind of standing to forgive someone. You have to have been wronged in some way. Socially, we can kind of construe wrongs. And so on the internet, when people get mad about someone doing something, they will construe a harm. You'll see them construing a harm. This is making X bad for everyone. This makes women look bad, which means this made me look bad. Right? I mean, and these are bullshit reasons, right? These are nonsense harms. They're made up. But people will construe harms. But then there are construals of harm that are like a little bit more sensible. So, for instance, when someone murders someone in society, is the public harmed? Well, I think you can sort of make a case for, yeah, we all have a stake and an interest in the laws being followed and our fellow citizens not being murdered. And so when they are attacked, laws are broken, and they are harmed, it does sort of redound onto us in a certain way. I mean, that's why I feel as invested in capital punishment as I do, because I'm a citizen and it's done in our names and so on and so forth. And it's also why other people feel as invested in capital punishment as they do on the other side. So I think you have a range of behaviors people do, from the kind of spurious to the more sensible, where they kind of gain standing or give themselves standing to forgive. And one response you can do to that is to say, this is ridiculous, you don't have any standing, butt out and mind your own business. But people are very social, and so the thing I would rather do is just take that as an opportunity to say, well, okay, so you have a broad sort of social vision. The better thing to do is focus on being a forgiving person, taking a forgiving approach to this sort of broad social view that you want to take. And in terms of forgiveness and leniency, I mean, yeah, that's sort of, low-key one of the precepts of my religion is we should sort of be forgiving in order to be forgiven. I think that's a good thing.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Hi. So one thing that I guess I struggle with that I think might be relevant is that spite can be a great motivator. And you touch on this a little bit, that when you forgive, you're giving something up. You're almost surrendering a part of you. But with that, spite can be incredibly powerful and fulfilling. And just vengeance itself can be fulfilling, but the seeking and progression towards vengeance, the getting up every day and like wanting to seek out vengeance. And you see that in movies, of course, quite a lot. It's very fulfilling. So when you forgive and you give that up, you can often be left feeling just totally empty.
Yes, no, I mean, John Wick would be a much less cool movie.
Yeah.
If he were a forgiving person, right? Yeah, I mean, I certainly sympathize with this. And I mean, I think forgiveness has to come part and parcel with other virtues, right? It's a virtue that doesn't really stand alone. It has to do with a certain way of looking at society and people and yourself and so on and so forth. And ideally, it exists in community. You need other people. I am not, as I was saying to one of my friends about this talk, I don't speak as an expert on forgiveness or anything. It's not that I'm the most forgiving person in the world. It's just that I am interested in this topic because I see a lot in my work. I wouldn't dispute that anger can be a great motivator and that vengeance can be very fulfilling. I just think there are these logical problems with vengeance. For instance, how do you ever put an end to it? At what point, somebody steals your car and kills your dog? At what point have you killed enough members of the Russian mob? There are 4 movies now.
But well, the question is more what to replace it with, or how to address that emptiness and the lack of fulfillment, or the emptiness.
It's a good question, and I think it would have to be personal. I mean, some people experience that as a freedom, right? So the guy who forgave his sister's killer on death row told me that when he forgave his sister's killer, he experienced it as a lifting of bricks off his shoulders, right? So that is analogous to, it's similar to that feeling of emptiness, right? It's a relinquishing of something, but some people experience it as a motivator that's very fulfilling, and some people experience it as a burden. So person to person, I think it's going to be very different, that experience of forgiveness. And I wish that I could say that in every case it's going to be a healing experience, but I think you're quite right in that in some cases it won't be, which is why I don't argue for it from the therapeutic foot,
I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on the role of grace in forgiveness, because I was thinking that when I approach someone to be forgiven or I forgive others, I don't think that individual people really have a sort of cynical view of regaining of status or some sort of hierarchy that's been created that now needs to be rectified. I think that, when someone approaches you for forgiveness, you now have the opportunity to forgive, which is a very life-affirming and human and positive moment, an opportunity for you to experience the chance to have grace for someone else and hold space for someone else and their imperfections and their mistakes. And I think that people, to some degree, actually experience that as an opportunity rather than moral work, as one of the authors you responded to put it. So I was wondering if you could expand on the point of mercy and grace a little bit more.
Yeah, so this is Maisha Cherry's argument. So she coined this concept, racialized forgiveness, and she published a paper about it. And she also recently published a book, or is publishing a book, called Failures of Forgiveness. And the incident she's very interested in is the forgiveness of certain members of the Mother Emanuel Church shooting victims of Dylan Roof, right? So those survivors went into the courtroom, and Dylan Roof was, I think, being arraigned. I can't even quite remember what phase of trial he was in. But some survivors, some victims' family members, forgave him. And this was, hugely publicized, and because it was quite a radical act, and it was very moving. I think people felt very compelled by it. But in her point of view, it was a sort of distraction from the fact that there was this racist terrorism that had taken place, and she felt that it was sort of redirecting what should have been a sort of justified anger and outrage at white racist terrorism against black people. And sort of shifting it into a story about how black people are good and gracious because they are forgiving, and so on and so forth. This is her argument, and what it culminates in is the argument that it reproduces these structures of power because there are ultimately no consequences and no radical redress for racist offenses. I think, again, there's a possibility, there exists a possibility for forgiveness that is concomitant with consequences, right? I'm not saying that we just dispense with the criminal justice system, for example, because there are reasons for consequences that don't have to just do with being punitive, right? And I think that makes a lot of sense. So with Dylan Roof, for example, this is someone who has been impossible with his attorneys. He hates his entire defense team because they're women of color. He's unrepentant. He doesn't express any remorse, and if he were out on the street, he would still be dangerous. So I think there's plenty of reasons to penalize this person that exceed just vengeance, right? And so I think that forgiveness in this case wasn't a mistake. I think it was a good move that seemed to make a lot of sense to the family members, and I'm not going to be someone who steps in and says they were wrong. But that is Cherry's point of view is not necessarily so much that they were wrong, but that society cannot react to that in a non-racist way. That's her take.